Good evening, good evening, good evening. My name is Katerji, and welcome to the Katerji Show. Thanks so much for joining us for another episode. We're going to have, as I said yesterday, double Syria episode. It's back-to-back Syria episodes. Going to be continuing our conversation about the events in southern Syria. And talking about what's been going on in Syria as a whole. And we've got Charles Lister, who is head of the Syria program at the Middle East Institute, joining us. Before I invite him on, you may be seeing the news happening. It's the second consecutive night of protests here in Kyiv. Lots more people turned up at the protest tonight. It's still ongoing. I didn't stay there, obviously came back to do the show. But yeah, hopefully bring you more coverage of that as it unfolds over the next few days. People are pretty pissed off about this anti-corruption bill that stripped powers from these anti-corruption bodies and given them to the prosecutor general. So there's a lot of resentment building up here in Ukraine about that. Protests in multiple cities. As I said yesterday, I was at the protest yesterday. Even before the start time of the protest, the size was much larger today. So if the government was hoping that it could get away from this situation, appease the situation quickly, it looks like it's on for a bit more of a problem with this situation. But look, we will discuss that in full at our next opportunity to. Tonight, we're going to go back into Syria. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce my illustrious guest, Charles Lister. Welcome to the show, Charles.
Hi, Oz. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be on.
So to start with, why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself and your background, and then we'll dive right in.
Yeah, gosh, where to start? I'm a Brit and an American, so I have a foot on both sides of the Atlantic, recording right now in the UK, which is nice. I've been working on Syria full time, virtually 24/7 for the last 15 years. So it's everything and anything that I know and that has been making me busy over a long period of time. I am currently working at the Middle East Institute in Washington. MEI basically exists in a way that I would say, I know I'm biased, but I would say is slightly different to some other think tanks in the US, in which our mission is specifically to try to bridge the gaps and increase understanding between the United States and the Middle East, to improve the relationship between the United States and the Middle East region. But of course, also being British, I have a kind of European slant in the way that I look at America's relationship with the region too. I was last in Syria in February, 2 months after Bashar al-Assad's overthrow, heading back in probably 4 to 6 weeks' time. So yeah, I would say, I'm sure we'll come to talk about all of this stuff, but Assad's fall was an enormous historic development in the context of Syria and where Syria has been over many years. Presents huge opportunities, but also enormous challenges, some of which, or the consequences of some of which, we have seen playing out in very destructive ways over the past 10 days or so. But that's for further conversation.
Indeed, I myself, I visited Syria in December, like 2 or 3 days after the fall. I turned up, and obviously being immediately in the aftermath, not a lot had settled, not a lot was certain about the direction that any of the state functions would be heading in. And obviously we have had a little bit of time since the fall of the regime. The Syrian transition government, as they call themselves, have had time to bed in. There have also been multiple crises that have hit Syria already, ones in which the government definitely has responsibility for that. That's indisputable. Why don't we start with what's been happening on the coast? Now, we had Ayman al-Tamimi yesterday give us a primer, but I feel it's worth going through it all again from the start to get a varied perspectives on this, and try and get to the bottom of what's been going on, particularly who is responsible for the violence that's been carried out in these various skirmishes and obviously atrocities that have taken place in Sweden. And we'll come back onto the coastal areas and what happened in previous months, but let's really start with the Sweden situation.
Mm-hmm. So just to talk about what happened. Yeah, so I mean, I think the first thing to say is obviously we're roughly 7 months into this kind of post-Assad Syria. And in those 7 months, Sueda, being the kind of Druze majority province of Syria, has seen at least 5 bouts of quite significant internal fighting within the province. All of that fighting has been between the province's, sort of long-standing Bedouin community. Most of Sueda's Bedouins now are settled. So, of course, the traditional term Bedouin would suggest they're still nomadic, but most of the Bedouins who are in Sueda have been settled. Between them, or at least between many of their men, and the Druze community, Druze being a religious minority group with similarly long, almost ancient roots in parts of Syria, as well as Israel and Lebanon and elsewhere. So the first thing to sort of emphasize before I get into, the sort of chronology of everything that happened is that the roots of the conflict between the Bedouin and Druze communities in Sweden go way back before the 2011 uprising in Syria. Most of it's due to land ownership disputes, access and control of smuggling routes. The smuggling industry in Syria historically has been a huge thing, a huge part of the kind of shadow economy, and most of or a good deal of the covert, completely illegal smuggling that has gone through southern Syria has traditionally gone through the Sweda Desert. So whoever controls those vast tracts of territory in Sweda hold a great deal of potential financial power. And so a lot of the infighting we've seen between the Bedouin and the Druze are over exactly that. And of course, over the more recent years, most of the most financially lucrative smuggling activity in Sweden has been drugs. And so that has really intensified the kind of localized tensions that, as I say, over the past 7 months have flared up at least 5 times. But as to regards the most recent flare-up, which has certainly been on a far greater magnitude than the things that had preceded it, on July the 11th, on the night of July 11th, so 12 days ago, a Druze man was driving a truck full of vegetables down the highway from Damascus down south towards Sueda. He was stopped on the side of the road by a handful of Bedouin gunmen who took him out of the vehicle, beat him up, stole the truck and all of the vegetables. So that alone sounds like a relatively small incident compared to some of the much greater violence that's been happening elsewhere in Syria. But given those long-standing, more deeply rooted tensions, it meant that the following morning, Druze gunmen kidnapped a bunch of Bedouin men, and in retaliation, Bedouin gunmen kidnapped a bunch of Druze men, and we had an entire 24-hour period of tit-for-tat kidnappings. And so over the period of roughly 36 hours after that vegetable truck incident, we started to see a spiral of escalation between the Bedouins and between the Druze militias in Sweden. Cutting a very, very long story short, the Syrian government has had no military presence, no presence at all in Sweden Governorate. The Druze community have a long-standing sort of tradition of sort of almost semi-autonomy in Syria, had a long-standing relationship, of course, with the Assad regime and with the government, but more or less insisted on controlling most of the governance. They have continued that posture towards the new transitional government. So Syria's new transitional government had no presence. They stayed on the outside for 48 hours and kind of watched this localized conflict building up. Retrospectively, they were probably watching on and trying to send the message that if you want things to calm down, all of this chaos inside your province is because there is no government control, there is no government law and order, and what have you. Whether or not that's true, we can all debate, but I think that was probably their posture. On July the 14th, the government made the decision to step in and intervene, in their words, to enforce order and put an end to the conflict. Behind the scenes, forgive me because this is all going to take a while to explain, because a lot of stuff that was happening wasn't in public, but behind the scenes, the Syrian government had been in communication with the US government, with the Turkish government, with Jordan, with a bunch of different Gulf states, and with Sueda's Druze leaders, both religious and civil, to communicate their intention to eventually intervene if this localized conflict didn't end. On July the 12th, so we just rewind a couple of days, there had been a meeting in Azerbaijan, a secret meeting between the Syrian government and the Israeli government. During that meeting, part of the conversation discussed the concept that a Syrian sovereign government should have the right to intervene when violence flares up in any of its sovereign territory. And as foreign observers that I have spoken to who were in the room are concerned, and as far as the Syrian government was concerned, Israel agreed that the Syrian government should have the right to intervene when localized conflict erupts in its territory. So when Damascus made the decision on July the 14th to intervene, their belief was not only had their consultation with the United States and with regional states and the Druze leaders been sufficient, but they had also been kind of orange or green lighted by the Israelis. So they went in. About 20 minutes into the intervention on the main road into Sueda, the Syrian Transitional Government's Ministry of Defense was ambushed. 10 of their soldiers were rounded up and executed on the road. Their bodies were piled up and used for celebratory photographs by Druze militiamen that swiftly went onto social media. And 8 other soldiers were stripped down to their underwear and force marched to a nearby village where they were then executed up against a wall. That single incident right at the beginning of the government's intervention basically was like gallons of fuel poured onto a very small fire that suddenly detonated. The government saw this in many ways as the same as it saw on Syria's coast back in March, which was described at that time by the Alawite community as a military coup. So the government saw this development in Sueda as a kind of uprising against government authority. They also felt like they'd been tricked because the same militias who ambushed them on the road had given them, in their belief, permission to enter just a few hours earlier. And so basically from then on, everything went very bad. Government forces advanced very quickly and very aggressively. We started to see reports of crimes and reprisal killings and significant violence. And of course, Israel launched a military intervention. First drone strikes in Sueda and the neighboring province of Daraa, which is closer to Israel. And then soon thereafter, the following day, they struck the Ministry of Defense in Damascus, which was a huge and unprecedented escalation throughout all the many years of hundreds of thousands of Syrians being killed under Assad's rule. The Israelis never hit the Ministry of Defense, or in fact, any military building in Damascus. And so as far as Israel's intervention was concerned, that then turned what had been a localized conflict and was then a localized conflict that suddenly exploded. It turned it into one that was seen as, on all sides, as zero sum. So the government saw this as a fight for the identity of post-Assad Syria. If we don't put this down, our entire future is in question. The Druze community increasingly began to coalesce in a way that, frankly speaking, we hadn't really seen in previous months, behind the idea that this was now a fight for the survival of the Druze community and for Sueda and its identity. And the Bedouins suddenly found themselves right in the middle, and they saw themselves as suddenly being extraordinarily important players in the pursuit of, defining Syria's future. And all of that, the intensification, the fuel on the fire, the geopolitics from Israel, and the kind of sectarian element all meant that violence went crazy. Absolutely no question that government forces and forces linked to the government committed crimes and atrocities. Similarly, absolutely no question that Druze militia also committed crimes and atrocities. Now, 10 days later, we have a very fragile ceasefire still in place. That ceasefire is only in place because the international community intervened to negotiate, to basically enforce that. The Syrian government has been forced to withdraw again from Sueda. So we're back where we were when we started, but in a much more tense environment where everyone has pulled up the drawbridges and drew very thick red lines. And of course, hundreds of people are dead. And the Bedouin communities in Sueda are quote unquote evacuating, some would probably say being displaced from Sweden, which is also adding to the tensions. And the last thing I'll say is, on that note of evacuations or displacement, as you know, Oz, Syrians spent years and years and years being put onto green buses by the Assad regime and forcefully displaced to other areas of the country. And that the narrative around that forceful displacement became an extremely emotive driver of continued struggle against the regime. I worry a lot that the imagery being presented and being shown around these Bedouins being put on buses and quote unquote evacuated elsewhere in the country is going to add to, it's kind of like phase 2 of that anger, which again will only add to the sectarian tensions, the significant divide between Sweden in the southeast and the rest of government-controlled Syria, which basically means that the transition has a gigantic challenge on its hand in terms of, further consolidating its control, which I should say is precisely what the United States, all of Europe, all of the Middle East want to happen. They have made it very clear they want the transitional government, despite who they are and their challenges, to continue to expand and consolidate its rule. But doing so now is a hell of a lot harder than it was 2 weeks ago.
Now, the Israelis are going to claim that they went in and did these actions in defense of the Druze community. And they will argue, and again, I don't buy this, and every Middle East analyst I know that isn't basically just a mouthpiece for whatever the Knesset believes at that particular day thinks this was a catastrophe, a terrible idea for Israel to do. The Israelis will argue, or rather Netanyahu's group will argue, that they were doing it because the Druze were being, they're about to be genocided by Damascus. Now, we also know for a fact that there were definitely sectarian atrocities committed against the Druze by government forces. So, how do we interpret this situation? How does Damascus view the Druze, particularly now following these atrocities that have been committed? How do we reach a point of accountability where the government forces that were responsible, the senior people in charge, are punished for those crimes? And how can there be any trust in this transition government, which is not elected, to investigate itself, particularly given, and we'll move on to the coastal issue, but how can there be faith if you're a Druze, say, even one that's sympathetic to reconciliation with Damascus? How can you have any faith in, al-Sharaa and his government in what they're doing and how they move forward with any of this?
Yeah, I mean, well, that's not to sound crass about it, but that's the billion-dollar question that I don't think anyone really knows. I mean, the jury is out. That's the challenge on any transitional government, which is to win credibility through actions, not just words. And there's no question that the transitional government said a lot of really good words since it came into power, but the real test is actions. I think they've, in their eyes, proven themselves to their base, and that's not just jihadists, that's the majority of the Sunni community in Syria. They've certainly won and earned pretty good relationships with other minority communities, and we should acknowledge that the bridge building with the Ismaili community has been extremely effective. Bridge building with most of the Christian community, particularly the Catholics and some of the Orthodox churches, has been extremely effective. But there are deeper challenges with the Alawites on the coast, as you say. We'll come to talk about that, but also with the Druze. The unfortunate thing is that until this latest bout of fighting, the transitional government had actually invested a significant amount of effort in terms of dialoguing, if that's the right word, with the Druze community. The government appointed a governor to Sweden rather than a governor of, because he wasn't permanently based in Sweden, whose job was every single day to be engaging with the religious and civil and political leaders or notables in Sweden. And despite the fact that everyone in Sweden was guarded in their engagement, that dialogue in and of itself had made a lot of progress. And of course, we were at the point where, and I can't remember if I said this in the kind of chronology of how everything played out. We were in a place where on July 13th and 14th and 15th, we had 3 consecutive comprehensive ceasefire agreements negotiated between the government and Sweda's Druze leaders. Each one of those would have not just put an end to the conflict, but resulted basically in a compromise whereby Sweden would continue to control the majority of its own governance. But the Interior Ministry in Damascus would have basically been given the responsibility to pay and hire local security forces in Sweden to do law and order. The unfortunate reality was that each of those consecutive agreements was then revoked and violated by one Druze leader, Hikmet al-Hijri, which then only again added fuel to the fire that was already in place. This idea that there was, again, from the government's perspective, the idea that there was some kind of a conspiracy at play here. We keep negotiating these deals, and then suddenly this one guy keeps coming out and pulling out. And to add to the paranoia and the conspiracy, every time Hijri revoked his deals, the Israelis would suddenly start airstrikes. So the unfortunate thing is the bit of trust that had been built up in preceding months, almost all of that's gone now. The added unfortunate reality is the other Druze leaders who had been much more open to dialogue and to compromise and agreements with Damascus have now basically, as a result of all of the violence, I wouldn't say necessarily sided with Hijri, but have come around more to his way of thinking, which is there's no deal to be had under current circumstances. And the only guy who was still open to a deal has now fled Sweden, Laith al-Balus, and is based, I think, in Damascus. So we've got to start all the way from the very beginning again. Initial contact, initial negotiations, and as far as I'm concerned, the only way that's going to work is if we have third-party mediation. The Jordanians played a very frontline role in facilitating a lot of the talks that resulted in the ceasefire that we now have. My hope would be that Jordan, with some US support, will insert itself into basically saying, you guys have got to come to a deal. Let's start discussing security compromises, confidence building measures, the same kind of process that we now have in place between Damascus and the SDF in northeastern Syria. Fraught with a lack of trust, fraught with paranoia and plenty of conspiracy theories about what each other stand for, and fraught with lots of hostile history too, but still guided by the reality that if they collectively or individually want to have a better future, then everyone needs to come under one Syrian umbrella. Again, the reality is, right now as we're speaking, $6 billion of contracts are being signed in Damascus between Saudi investors and the Syrian government. Not 1 cent of any of those contracts will find itself in Sweden or in northeastern Syria because they are not under the rest of the Syrian umbrella. Again, doesn't mean that they have to concede everything and just subjugate themselves, but there does have to be some kind of a deal. If all of Syria and all of Syrians are going to benefit from the removal of Assad and everything he stood for, then there has to be more compromise. And again, Damascus has plenty to compromise on too. It's not that these other regions have to give up everything to make a deal. But again, just to end my very long answer, all of that has become so much more difficult as a result of what we've seen play out over the last couple of weeks.
So one final question on the south before I move to the coast, and then we try and talk about the SDF as well. From the government's perspective, they weren't involved, and then when they were involved, their forces were murdered, and then at that point, there were atrocities committed by their forces, which are not, fully under Damascus's control. It's not like a top-down level of structure that exists. These are loose coalitions of militants that have now been brought under one umbrella. So from Damascus's perspective, they'll be like, well, we didn't want to get involved, and we had no choice but to get involved. And then when we did, we were attacked. And then, and a lot of what I'm seeing from the government, or the pro-government voices, metastasizing around this idea that Hikmat al-Hijri is basically the be-all and end-all of the problem, and he's a problem because he's Israeli-backed, and so on and so forth. This seems like a very easy narrative for the government to try and spin, but the reality is significantly more complicated than that, and there can be no trust building, between Damascus and Sueda if Damascus is not willing to make concessions, as you said, but those concessions have to involve, the punishment of people that have rampaged through Jews' areas, right?
Yeah, sorry, I forgot about that part of your question. I mean, that's to me that it has to. Yeah, there is going to be no reconciliation in Syria, in any of Syria, and in any way, until the government shows that it acknowledges the need for accountability on its side. The blunt reality is that since Assad fell, the government has talked a good game about justice and accountability for Assad regime crimes, and in fact, they've surged a great deal of resources into hunting down Assad regime, what they call remnants, all across the country, and to an extent that has placated a lot of the grievances and anger within all of the many communities who'd been victimized by the regime. But they haven't done very much to acknowledge any form of accountability for any kind of crimes they may have committed before Assad fell. And that was the original demand, even if it by a magnitude far, far smaller than anything Assad ever did. They needed to show that awareness. And even more so since the violence we saw.
I'll just play devil's advocate there to interject, to say that the government again would also argue that there are Assad era war criminals that it allows to continue to function with freedom as some sort of way of moving beyond. Again, this is not a unique situation. We have the basic amnesty that existed for the Good Friday Agreement, which meant that, and that's still rumbling on today. Still, people want to see soldiers prosecuted for crimes committed by the British state in Northern Ireland. However, the British state and the soldiers and the military figures will argue, well, we had an amnesty, and the amnesty was, meant that there should be no prosecution. So this is a complex thing that still exists in, liberal democracies decades after a conflict. This is Syria that we're talking about, never been a democracy. They're trying to have a democratic transition according to the governing authorities. But how do they move forward in this environment?
Yeah, well, I think probably by acknowledging the very things you have just said, which is, there's no such thing as a perfect post-conflict reconciliation process, that amnesties by definition have to happen because no one has the capacity to, detain, prosecute and imprison hundreds of thousands of people who at some point in time over the past 14 years committed crimes. It's just impossible. And as you say, the government has run its own amnesty program. But where I was coming to with my original answer was that all this stuff's a double-edged sword. For this government and for any post-conflict government, it's a double-edged sword, because if they show a more aggressive approach to Assad regime remnants, then they risk creating further grievances and skepticism and potentially hostility from communities from which those remnants originated. If they show less, i.e., more amnesties, they risk inflaming tensions from the communities who had been persecuted so aggressively by the regime. And frankly speaking, we've already seen some of that in recent months. There are many, many people in Syria who think that this transitional government hasn't done nearly enough to crack down upon regime remnants all across the country. In fact, apart from these occasional, very significant flare-ups of violence, the consistently most significant source of deadly violence in Syria every single week is vigilante justice. People returning to their villages or towns from which they've been displaced years and years ago, only to find that the man who killed their sister 8 years before, is still living in the neighboring village with his family, and then that man takes a gun in daylight and goes and shoots that man dead in the neighboring village. That stuff is happening all across the country every single day. And so it's a double-edged sword from the government's perspective when it comes to that kind of justice and accountability. But when it comes to, accountability for what's just happened in Sweden or what happened on the coast in March, from an international perspective, in order to continue to achieve the credibility of the international community, who are so desperate to see Syria succeed, then there has to be accountability for those crimes. But at the same time, the government is very well aware that if it was to overcharge, over-prosecute too many people within its own security apparatus or its base, it risks turning its security apparatus or parts of it, or its base or parts of it, against the transitional government. So it is an almost impossible challenge. But on a principled level, absolutely they have to show accountability on all sides. But am I betting that they're going to get that right? Not necessarily. A, given their track record, and B, perhaps just as importantly, given the fact that this transitional government has basically no resources. I mean, they are still barely able to even pay senior level salaries. This is a government that basically has no economy to speak of. Now, that might not necessarily be a situation that lasts forever, but when you have a desperate lack of capacity, it is very, very hard to launch a judicial process that involves judges prosecuting dozens and dozens of people over a sustained period of time in public. So they should do it. Let me make that very clear. They do need to do that, but it is also extremely difficult given the circumstances that they face.
So let's talk about accountability, because what's happening in Sweden isn't the only massacre that we've seen. The massacres happened in March. At least 1,000 Alawites were killed. Many of them civilians. Many of them murdered in sectarian violence by either government forces or government-aligned forces. That distinction might not mean much to most people, and that's fair enough. That's a fair point to make. It's only a distinction that we make because we understand the more nuanced nature of the groups that Damascus has aligned with in the past, and also that some of those alliances are out of a pragmatic need to not have a flank of radicals to your right pressuring you. They still have the ISIS issue to deal with, obviously. So again, we're not using that term government aligned to minimize the government's responsibility for this. And I will go further and I will say that it is the government's responsibility to deal with all violence in Syria, regardless of who's perpetrating it. And that was always the issue with the Assad regime, is that there was never going to be any accountability. So there is already a difference in the fact that this government, we call them a government even though they're not elected yet, has at least looked to the outside world and said, we want to clear our own house. We acknowledge there are violations committed by people on our side. That in and of itself is a big step for Syria, and I don't think we should gloss over that. But it's not enough, and there are many diehard, committed Syrian revolutionaries who lost many, 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 many things in order to achieve a Syria that we have without the Assad regime, who are very angry at the government. We're talking Sunni Arabs who are very angry at the government over what happened on the coast. They see this report as not being enough because the findings aren't public. You may know a lot more about the findings of that than most people do. So can you tell us about what the government has attempted to do with regards to that? Give us a little background about what happened on the coast as well to give us the context here. And, is this a step towards accountability? There's a lot of people very skeptical that it isn't a step towards accountability. But again, it's trying to also acknowledge the fact that by acknowledging their own side committed any crime at all, we are in a different world altogether from Assad Syria. And the other point I'll make before I pass over to you is that many Syrians who were displaced from Syria have started to return home, and those are Syrians who are the middle classes, who are part of the first people that rebelled against the regime, and they have strong ideas about the kind of Syria they want to see built, a democratic Syria. So the regime, the government is not still dealing with, Assad Syria. It's dealing with a Syria that is much more aware of its rights, much more aware of what kind of civil governance they want Syria to be, and that's also a tightrope that the government now has to follow. It can't just keep its radicals appeased and just the Sunni Arab population. It has also, a significant part of the Sunni Arab population that wants secular governance, that wants, and this is now the reality. Governance is the reality. It's no longer a state of war against a regime. All of this, the buck stops with al-Sharaa and his people. So, what's going on with this coastal report, and does it advance anything, or is it just a show for the international community and for certain elements of Syrian society, rather than any actual step towards it?
Yeah, so great, lots of questions in there, and you asked me to briefly describe what happened on the coast. So I'll start with that and then go to the report and what it hopefully means, but we'll see. Well, let me backtrack a little bit. So the real violence we saw in early March, but what we started to see in late January and through February this year was the emergence of a kind of fledgling anti-government insurgency that was predominantly based in Syria's two coastal governorates along the Mediterranean, Latakia and Tartus. Now, of course, historically, that was the region that the Assad regime and its Alawite minority had sort of dominated. Also, I should say, the Assad regime had dominated within the Alawite minority on the coast. And so this anti-government insurgency in late January and February was pretty rudimentary. I mean, we're talking here, two guys in a car or two guys on a motorbike. They drive past a checkpoint, spray a few bullets. If they were lucky, they might injure a Syrian soldier, and then they drive off into the mountains to escape. So pretty basic stuff. But the frequency of their attacks started to sort of pick up through this late January and through February period. All of a sudden, on March 7th, we had about 42 attacks near simultaneously launched all across the Mediterranean coast in Latakia and Tartus. Almost every single government security checkpoint on Syria's Mediterranean coast was hit within about 30 minutes of each other. And as we now know, at least 100 Syrian soldiers were killed in those initial attacks. So suddenly, out of nowhere, compared to what we had seen, as I say, in late January and early February, this anti-government insurgency looked like a totally different beast in terms of capabilities, sophistication, discipline, targeting and intelligence, everything else. As the government dispatched its special forces and what it calls its general security service from Damascus to respond to those attacks, and as those forces arrived into southern Tartus, they were ambushed from every high point across the highway. So they found it difficult to even get up to the coast. So in a very similar way as I was describing, the first ambush in Sweden serving as that kind of gallons of fuel that was poured on a very small fire and everything sort of exploded. A similar sort of dynamic happened on the coast, whereby this sudden assault against the government and significant killing of government forces created this perception that what was happening all of the sudden was an existential challenge to post-Assad Syria and to this transitional government's rule. And let me add an added bit of context here, which I think will be a long-standing subject of debate for Syrians and Syria subject matter, experts or people or observers like myself. When Ahmed al-Sharaa walked into Damascus on December the 8th, he made a speech, I think the following day in the Umayyad Mosque, in which one of his most powerful lines when you speak to Syrians was that, "I am giving you your country back." This idea that for the first time in most Syrian people's lives, they were being told that they had a stake in their country's future. They had a role to play. They had a duty to play to help to rebuild their country. And at the time, this was perceived as like an amazing step, like this amazing phrase, you know, I am giving you your country back. And it wasn't just something that pleased his base. This was something that, you know, the vast majority of Syrians saw as like a really encouraging sign, especially given who Ahmed al-Sharaa was. And this was very early days. So when this challenge to post-Assad Syria suddenly emerged in such a dramatic fashion on the coast, the government put out what it called a mobilization order to its security forces, but it made that order public. And suddenly, in my opinion at least, the idea that the Syrian government had said, or, you know, the transition had said, we've given you your country back. And then fast forward 2-3 months, and suddenly that quote unquote, that country is suddenly under assault and we've issued a general mobilization order. What we didn't just see was the mobilization of security forces up to the coast. We also saw thousands of normal, ordinary men from all across the country just get up into their personal vehicles, drive to the coast, and exact revenge, because they saw this as some kind of a challenge to everything that they had hoped and aspired for, which was post-Assad Syria, which they could recover and rebuild and everything else. So that really contributed towards that organic chaos. And underneath that, as you'll know, Oz, you know, sectarianism is a really real thing in Syria. Not almost no Syrian I speak to wants to acknowledge or talk about sectarianism as being a thing, but it is a very real thing. And it is not just a thing that emanates from Sunni Syrians. It is a thing that exists in every community in Syria that I have experienced. When I was there in February, one of the things that struck me most was when an Ismaili woman came up to me at the end of a long meeting and said, one of these days, the Alawites are going to get what's coming to them. That's minority on minority stuff. And that's not just grievances that emanated from the post-2011 revolution and civil conflict. Those are grievances that go back to the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s. This is a gigantic challenge for Syria going forward. Anyway, I took a really long time to explain the roots of what happened on the coast. What then followed was complete chaos, reprisal killings, massacres, sectarian killings. One thing that doesn't get discussed enough was that there were also Alawite on Alawite violence. Members of the insurgency attacked rival Alawite villages that had refused to give them safety during what they were calling a military coup. So it was total chaos. And long story short, at least 1,400 people were killed in the space of around 48 hours. The vast majority of them very innocent Alawite civilians. And so now we are where we are today, where the transitional government had given a committee of almost all of them lawyers and judges 4 months to investigate everything that had happened, and basically to draw up lists of anyone who had been concretely implicated in crimes. And the committee provided its findings and the report to Ahmed al-Sharaa several days ago. I forget the exact date. And then yesterday they issued a press conference in which they provided a summary of the findings. And I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but you know, nearly 300 people, I think, implicated in attacks against government forces, and a similar number of people, I suspect the vast majority of them, government forces, implicated in attacks against the Alawite community. All of those names, I think at least 550 in total, have been given to the Syria's public prosecutor. And do I know what's going to happen with that? I don't know for certain. I am told by normally very reliable sources with significant influence in Damascus that there is a real intent to act on this, in large part because in the last 7 months, Syria has had probably the most dramatic international opening that any post-conflict country has ever had. Over 75 governments have traveled to Damascus in 7 months. That is a extraordinary surge to a post-conflict capital, and almost all sanctions have been lifted. Ahmed al-Sharaa, more than anyone else, cannot risk losing that by failing to show accountability. That's my optimistic take. But having said that, as we were talking a few minutes ago, this whole accountability issue is a very double-edged sword. And if names within those lists include, as I understand they do, senior commanders within what was the Syrian National Army, as an example, that isn't just going to prove a domestic challenge for Ahmed al-Sharaa, given the fact that those figures now hold significant leadership titles within the Ministry of Defense. It's additionally complicated because those figures are now also Turkey's primary line into the Ministry of Defense. And so there will be significant concern in Ankara that some of their most reliable and long-standing partners may find themselves, named on these lists and implicated in crimes that will have to be prosecuted. So it is a very complicated challenge for the transitional government. But again, coming back to the same conclusion, if they don't show real accountability for these crimes, they've lost the minorities. And the challenge of negotiating agreements with places like Druze majority province in Sweden, or the SDF-held northeast, or even in terms of long-time stabilization on the coast, is going to be 100 times harder if they don't. And Ahmed al-Sharaa is a pretty smart guy. I think he knows that this has to happen, but actually, demonstrating that into real actions is easier said than done. But I'm optimistic we'll see something happen. And last thing I was told yesterday was that within days there will be signs that this process is beginning. So if I'm keeping my fingers crossed, that's the optimistic take.
So I'll move on to the SDF shortly because we've got some breaking news coming in about that.
Mm-hmm.
But before I do, I just want to ask you again a question, your professional opinion and your opinion as someone who is having these conversations in Damascus. There will be criticism from a very valid place, considering al-Sharaa's past involvement with AQI and ISI, that al-Sharaa himself is a fundamentalist Islamist who wants to cleanse Syria of its minorities, or at the very least subjugate those minorities to the whims and wills of the Sunni Arab majority. Now, that again, there is truth to elements of that, considering his story. However, there will be people around him and in Damascus that are arguing that that's not the case, that he doesn't have those views towards minorities, and that the massacres that are happening by forces that are aligned to him are in spite of his wishes. That's a complicated subject to broach, especially considering, again, and I'm speaking from a place of putting the death of people that I was friends with directly onto al-Sharaa's doorstep. So this is the place that I'm coming to from this. What is your take on al-Sharaa, and what is his vision for Syria, do you think, going forward?
So it's a difficult question to answer without angering somebody in some way, but I think, and it's also just a difficult question, full stop, because it's complicated. Let me start by saying that in my nearly 15 years working on Syria, and for a majority of that focusing on the armed groups and the armed conflict, I spent 3.5 years full time negotiating with all of the armed groups in Syria, try and bring them into the peace process, meeting them face to face every single week for 3.5 years. So, I've got to know a lot of these people quite intimately. And what I have seen is many men of Ahmed al-Sharaa's generation, and he's only a few years older than I am, and then also many men of his father's generation, younger father, I would say, probably, but more like in their 50s now, have traveled a similar journey whereby in their youth they ended up falling into and embracing extremism, jihad, traveling to pursue that. And then when they had the opportunity to return to Syria and to exert their energies into something that was, in their words, to their homeland, their ideological perspectives changed. And I've known some men for whom they've described this to me as an immediate epitome. Sorry, not epitome. What's the word?
Epiphany.
something that like
Epiphany.
epiphany. It's literally like set foot on Syrian soil for the first time in 20 years, and it was instant. It's this instant, like, what the hell have I done with my life? I've got to dedicate myself to my homeland. And others for whom it took years of very gradual change. Now, in none of those cases have those men given up their conservative beliefs, but they have completely renounced the idea that those beliefs should be dedicated either to converting people to their beliefs or to, some kind of global struggle. And I say all of that to say that from all of my experience, that appears to have been the journey that Ahmed al-Sharaa has sort of, experienced and traveled along over the years. When he walked into Damascus, on December the 8th last year, he made a number of different speeches and addresses and issued a number of written statements. But what was really, really interesting, again, to me as an analyst who pays attention to these small things, was when his group, Jabhat al-Nusra, back in July 2016, undertook its first rebranding and claimed to have broken ties with al-Qaeda. His then spokesman, who
it takes me back. Just hearing those stories, it's like the arguments that we had of whether this was serious. It seems fascinating now that this is where we are, but yeah, you're correct.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it was serious back then. At least I knew that at the time, because there'd been months and months of negotiations to get there. But I mean, at that time, he had an Australian Saudi spokesman. His name was Mustafa Mohammed Farag. Very, very eloquent guy who gave a number of interviews to Western media, CNN, I think BBC and some others. You can go back and see some of those interviews. He used precisely the same language in July 2016 as Ahmed al-Sharaa did when he took Damascus in late 2024. Precisely the same language, copy paste, exactly the same words. So first things to say is we haven't just like suddenly seen a suit wearing Ahmed al-Sharaa who changed overnight when he took Damascus. This has been a long journey in which politics and being pragmatic, it doesn't mean being moderate, it means being pragmatic, trumped the jihad and everything that came with it. So that's the first sort of, I guess, bunch of anecdotes to tell one story, which is, I believe on a human level, having seen it myself, it is possible to travel along that journey of learning and change. And it is a fact that the kind of language and agenda and vision that was painted on December the 8th when they took Damascus was part of thinking that developed 8+ years earlier, and continued to develop over those 8+ years. The other thing to say is Ahmed al-Sharaa grew up in one of the most expensive districts of Damascus. He went to a very elite private school in Damascus. He grew up in a family that was well enough connected that, it might sound silly, he could probably have been talking politics around the dinner table without having a concern that the regime was going to come knocking, which was a very unique upbringing compared to most Syrians. He really did grow up in a kind of elite, academic, intelligent household. And that
wasn't there
something.
That letter that his father seemed annoyed that his son was experimenting with neoliberal policies, which annoyed his old left-leaning nationalist father, right?
Yes, exactly. And an acclaimed Syrian economist who worked not just for the Syrian government, but also for the Saudis for a long time. So, yeah, I mean, I think we also have to acknowledge where he came from, because, childhood upbringing does count for something, even if you lose that for many years. We also have to acknowledge that when he traveled to Iraq in 2003, he did so alongside thousands of other young Syrian men. We shouldn't forget that at the time, Bashar al-Assad's Grand Mufti issued a fatwa in which he said it was religiously mandated on every young Syrian man to travel to Iraq to fight the Americans.
And he was a teenager as well. We should point that out. He was a teenager.
So it's not to excuse what he did by any means, but it is to put it in that context. It's also a fact that the vast majority of his time in Iraq was spent in prison. And in fact, the only reason why he traveled up the rung of authority or leadership within AQI was because in prison, he became known as the guy who'd keep writing like my equivalent of policy papers that he would then present to the leadership. And he was increasingly seen as this kind of quite He had big aspirations for himself. He was also smart and well read, and he was capable of coming up with strategy. And that resulted in
Technocratic jihadism.
yeah, right, exactly. So that resulted in him climbing up the ladder, and then meant that when he was finally released a few months before the Syrian uprising started, he had perfectly positioned himself to be the smart young Syrian who could be dispatched to Syria to run the Islamic State in Iraq's Syrian wing. Anyway, fast forward all these years to today, I basically see Ahmed al-Sharaa as having traveled that journey I described earlier, having had the opportunity to pursue something in Syria, in his homeland, resulting in, I think, much more of a gradual evolution rather than the kind of epiphany one that some people have experienced. But he's also someone who, when he came back to Damascus, went back to visit his childhood school and saw the same woman who had taught him as a child. That was one of the first things he did. He also went back to his childhood home in Damascus. So he clearly sees that childhood as something that was quite formative for him. And then, yes, he adorned a suit and a tie and got a very fancy watch from the Saudis and everything else. But what he's really done is quite effectively re-embraced his childhood elite Damascene persona, which has until now, whatever you think of him, been seemingly very effective for him individually. Much bigger questions to ask about people around him and around the Ministry of Defense and what have you. But he, as an individual, has really curried a great deal of international and domestic acceptance, at least. One of the things that struck me most, and for obvious reasons, I won't name any names here, but there are several countries in the Middle East who historically have been downright hostile to anyone who was even close to political Islam. Right? Really, like, we go to war, no holds barred if you have a beard and pray 5 times a day, because you're probably suspicious and on a conveyor belt towards jihad. So the foreign minister of one of those countries told me in a recent meeting that when he first met Ahmed al-Sharaa, he came out and then said, "I was awed by him." That was his word. I was awed by him. I've heard that same word, awed, and like incredibly impressed, by many of the senior officials who've gone to meet him from the West and from several regional countries over the months. So again, not to celebrate him, his past, or anything else, but simply to state facts. He, as an individual, seems to have curried great respect amongst much of the international community that has fallen squarely behind him and his transition, despite all of the challenges. And that, I think, for now at least, counts in his favor. But it may not count in his favor forever if he doesn't start to show progress in some of these much more challenging areas, and some of them we've talked about here in terms of accountability.
So we'll go on to the final bit of the show. And if you guys, thanks so much for staying with us for the whole hour. If you've got any questions, user questions, audience questions you want to throw at us, throw at Charles, please do write them now in the chat, and we'll see if Charles has the time to answer one of them. But the final bit is we have some breaking news. Muslim Abadi, chief of the SDF, Syrian Democratic Forces, those are the Kurds aligned with the United States, has travelled to France, and a delegation headed by the Syrian Foreign Minister Shibani. They are in France for meetings. The French are hoping to try and reconcile Damascus with, I suppose you call them Rojava. How is that progressing? With what's happened in Latakia and Tartus and what's happened in Sweden over the last few months, the SDF, while having pressure, international pressure from, as you said, all of Syria's partners, I guess you could call them now, want Syria to restore full territorial integrity over all of Syrian land, basically, not just for counter-terrorism purposes, but also development purposes, drug smuggling, as you said, that's a really big thing, particularly for the Jordanians and the Lebanese. So look, this is, how are the SDF going to move forward with this? What do you see on the horizon over the next few months with these discussions between the Damascus and the SDF?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Well, I mean, I'll start off by saying that, in my opinion, as a long time follower and analyst of Syria, it's these, I think I may have referenced this earlier, but it's these kind of unresolved territorial issues that are going to define whether or not this transition can truly succeed and consolidate or not. And amongst all of those, the SDF held Northeast is by a significant magnitude the most important. 80% of Syria's oil and gas resources lie in SDF held areas. It, at least historically, was Syria's agricultural belt. So really incredibly important region of Syria for the transition to be able to, regain control of in one way or the other. In March this year, Mazloum Abdi and Ahmed al-Sharaa signed what was called a framework agreement. It was basically it was really an agreement that saw both sides agree and acknowledge the idea that the SDF held Northeast was going to have to integrate into the rest of Syria. That was pretty much it. It was kind of a handshake agreement that that integration was going to have to happen. But it was a significant development. Mazloum coming out in photograph, with Ahmed al-Sharaa was a hugely symbolic development. And of course, as you'll remember, Oz, Syrians all across the country came out in massive celebration that night. Probably we hadn't seen a celebration that big since Assad's fall. Fireworks all across the country, huge celebrations, which goes to show just how important Syrians see this potential. So that was the kind of hopeful point in March. The months that followed saw very, very little progress in terms of building on that kind of handshake agreement. There was kind of agreement to sort of demilitarize certain front lines in the north, but nothing of substance in terms of a political agreement began to develop. And then, right before all the Sweda violence we discussed right at the beginning of this, there was an unprecedented sort of landmark summit in Damascus, which was organized and facilitated by the United States and by France. And it brought together Mazloum, Ahmed al-Sharaa, and all of their delegations. And it was intended, as I understand from the US side, it was intended to more or less seal the deal. Although there might have been some other minor things to negotiate, it would have been the kind of landmark summit that made it clear that an agreement was coming. As it happened, not only did they not come to any kind of an agreement, almost every line that they had previously agreed in principle was backtracked. The SDF hardened their negotiating positions and their red lines on almost everything, and on several things they completely repealed and added whole new conditions. So that was a really kind of pessimistic time. That was, I think, July the 9th, so it wasn't very long ago. And that was, at least for me, like a real kind of wake-up moment that, my God, we might be a very, very long way away from having this real agreement sealed. And the reason why I was so kind of, frustrated at it was because the US military is not on its way out of Syria, but it is significantly drawing down. The ISIS threat has not only not gone away, it has shown really concerning signs of potential urban resurgence, which is what you really, really worry about. There's a real threat that ISIS is going to try and copy what it did in Iraq during the US occupation, whereby in a transitional environment, it seeks to play on sectarian divides and stir up a sectarian war. And in that scenario, countering terrorism, countering ISIS has no chance if Syria remains so substantively divided. There has to be an integration to make that fight more effective. And that is unquestionably, that's the conclusion drawn by the US. So in the wake of Sweda, we've seen a really big push by the US and then latterly by the French to try to get these talks back up and going. And in that context, we've seen, yes, this Paris meeting planned. We also, by the way, saw a meeting, although it wasn't publicized. I'm not sure if it still has been, but that was a meeting a couple of days ago in Oman, where the SDF and the Syrian government also tried to nail down lots of their areas of disagreement. So in theory, this is a good thing. We've got really serious international mediation underway. All aiming towards pushing this towards a compromise. And frankly speaking, just like I described with Sweda, third-party external mediation is the only way we're going to see progress. And to be frank, when it comes to the SDF, the US has made a pretty hard line with the SDF in recent months. There have been ultimatums, there have been deadlines on all manner of different things pushed to the SDF. And they're increasingly in a place where they're in such a tight corner, they have no choice really but to make a deal, or to back out altogether and find another supporter, which I don't think they're likely to do, but that's pretty much their only other option. And their only other option would be the Russians, who still have a presence in SDF-held territory. But I think that's very unlikely. So this is, I hope, a moment for optimism. We will see. You know, the proof will be in the pudding as to whether or not we get really positive readouts from these meetings. But in theory, it's fantastic that the US and the French in this case are really working very hard to push this forward, because Syrians need good news at the moment. And again, from the very cold perspective of acknowledging that Syria is going to be really unstable for a long time, given how deep those grievances are, given how deep the divides are. The idea that Syria is going to be completely stable anytime soon is sadly a fantasy. But one of the best ways of keeping those tensions under wraps is good news and clear signs of progress. We've had the economic opening and the sanctions relief, and that really helps. But now Syrians need food on the table and they need more electricity. But signs that the state is beginning to make compromise deals, and it will involve a lot of decentralized governance, by the way, which we've been led to understand the government's unwilling to do. I know for a fact they are willing to do it with conditions. But all of that will send more positive signals. And if people see good news, they're much less inclined to take out their weapons and go and do bad stuff. So yeah, any good news at this point is good news.
Well, look, we've got one final question before I hit that question up. I just wanted to thank you, Charles, for your time.
Sure.
If people want to find out more about your work, where would they recommend you go? I'll put a link in the show notes, but if you say now, I'll send people your way.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I have my sort of profile page at the Middle East Institute has most of the things I write, but I also have a Substack, SyriaWeekly.com.
Your Substack, Syria Weekly, of course. I'll send people to Syria Weekly. But again, I just wanted to thank you. Thank you so much for coming on this new show. Without, you know, we're still growing. I will say for our audience, the YouTube channel has grown by 100% within the last fortnight. So, you know, really thank you so much for everyone that's watching and, you know, hitting that like and subscribe button. Really, really appreciate all of the help that you guys are helping us to grow the channel. And thanks to all of our guests that come on, like Charles, who make the conversations that we have week in, week out so interesting. The final question is a user question, comes from Imran010, who says, how did al-Sharaa's transition over the years translate in how he ran Idlib? And again, this is something we spoke about quite a lot in December, but it's sort of been forgotten. And you touched on it with the talking about the sorry, I've forgotten what are they called again? The Ismailis. That's it. I got it. Sorry, the Ismailis. Yeah. Sorry. I could only think of Ahmadiyya in my head, and I'm like, no, it's not the Ahmadiyya. It's not them. It's the other ones. Yeah, yeah. So look, the Ismailis, the outreach that al-Sharaa did it with the Ismailis. There were also Christian communities living in Idlib. From 2016 onwards, how did al-Sharaa progress through Idlib? And we can close us out with that question, Charles.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, there were a lot of different things he did. They were gradual. For some of them, they were kind of grudging in a way, but proved to be effective. I mean, the first and the biggest one in those very early days was to accept Turkish military troops to be deployed into northwestern Syria. And at that time, even if they had rebranded, they were still an organization that by and large still looked like and acted like, you know, global jihadists. So the idea of accepting a nation state's military into your own territory and then to negotiate and accept a ceasefire deal with Russia whilst it was bombing Syrians all across the country, those two steps put together were kind of the first sign that this group was willing to become more politically pragmatic. Domestically, so quote unquote domestically within Idlib, outreach to minority communities, religious minorities was a pretty transformative development for any group with the kind of roots that they did. So that was certainly a significant thing. And as you say, that was with Ismailis, that was with Christians, and frankly speaking, it was also with Druze, who also have a presence in parts of Idlib, and who had suffered killings by the predecessors of HTS.
And
And so,
forced
yeah,
conversions, we should say as well. There was
yeah,
reports of
and forced
yeah.
conversions. Exactly. So I mean, so yeah, making steps to try to reverse the damage of earlier years with minority communities. HTS spent its own money to rebuild a number of churches in Idlib, as an example. Yeah, none of that, I should always qualify all of this to say, none of that was to say that their governance of Idlib was, kind and democratic. It wasn't. If I was to have one concern about Ahmed al-Sharaa today, it isn't to do with his religious ideology, but it is to do with the fact that I still think he has more dictatorial tendencies. If anything, I would see him today as kind of Syria's MBS. He sees himself as this young kind of honorary monarch, young, forward-looking, cosmopolitan guy who wants to bring his country into the future, but not necessarily cede his power to others. And in Idlib, it was certainly rule with a greater iron fist. And certainly, as you know, and as I know, there were individuals in those years who were assassinated by HTS for speaking out too publicly and critically of HTS. So, we shouldn't sort of cherry coat all of this. But the governance in and of itself was also, including with an iron fist, more stable and, frankly speaking, by and large, more effective than the governance we saw from the Turkish-backed Syrian opposition in northern Aleppo, or from the SDF and its autonomous administration in the northeast, or from the Syrian regime. And, when you go to Syria today, driving in Idlib feels like a completely different country than the rest of Syria. Working traffic lights, road rules,
That's
road
true.
lanes,
It's
24/7
also the
electricity.
types of vehicles that are on the road
Yeah,
show like it's
exactly.
all 4x4s in Idlib, and you go down to Damascus and then people are driving these 1970s old Mercedes that are falling apart.
Yeah, exactly. And then, and like on a normal living basis, 24/7 electricity, whereas, the regime held Damascus had about 2 hours a day. And things like shopping malls, they built a bunch of shopping malls in which, international products had been exported and were being sold at half the price of their equivalents anywhere else in Syria. And we're in this weird place when after Assad fell, people with the means to do so traveled from long-held regime areas up to Idlib to go and see these shopping malls. And we had these weird TV reports where all these Syrians who had sort of been willing to live under Assad for so long were sort of celebrating these amazing HTS shopping malls in Idlib. So, that kind of development and stability and order was pretty significant. I mean, it meant that nearly 4 million people continued to live under HTS relatively willingly, in a way that Syrians were fleeing areas all over the rest of Syria. And they, of course, most importantly, to cut a very long answer short, they also established a sort of semi-technocratic government. And it was that, they call it the Salvation Government. It was the Salvation Government that was initially the caretaker government after Assad fell. These weren't like super professionals, but they were technocratic enough that they knew the fields in which they were responsible for. And that, a semi-technocratic government, was quite frankly not what we had seen in northern Aleppo, and it certainly wasn't what we'd seen in the autonomous administration in the northeast. And that was something that has been replicated on a greater scale since he took Damascus, with the appointment of a genuinely professional transitional government, with the exception of a few insiders that he put into what he calls the sovereign ministries. Everyone else is a real professional. I just met the other day, most recently, with the central bank governor, who was visiting Washington and New York. And, he spent his entire career working for Ernst and Young. All around the world. These are real professionals now who are in this government, and the impetus to do something like that, I would say, developed in part through the Salvation Government in Idlib.
We have just one final question here from one random Algerian. I know we touched on it already. He just says, are you optimistic about the integration of the SDF held areas into that reconciliation with Damascus? Do you think that it's going to happen at some point?
Well, I think I was very pessimistic a week ago. But since see and as a result of as the question suggests, because of events in Sueda, that was a real. I mean, first of all, there was that the summit in Damascus, which I described earlier, which just comprehensively failed, and then the violence in Sueda, which I think will have encouraged them to dig their heels in even deeper and not give up their weapons. But the encouraging side of this equation is the doubling down of American and French mediation. And what I know behind the scenes is that the Americans have said to the SDF, you have to make a deal. This is like, time is up now. We gave you August as a deadline, and there have been SDF denials of that, but that is a fact. They were given the end of August as a deadline to make their integration deal with Damascus. And Donald Trump doesn't mess around. He's made it pretty clear he doesn't see the US having a military long-term military future in Syria. And as we've seen in the case of sanctions, when Donald Trump says something has to happen, it tends to happen really fast, whether it's a good decision or a bad decision. And I think the SDF have probably learnt that too, that if they've been told by a Trump appointee, Ambassador Thomas Barak, that the clock is ticking and you guys have got to make a deal, they probably realize that the clock probably is ticking and they do probably have to make a deal.
And there's no further patrons coming down the line. So I keep saying one final question. We've got Noor Ghazal 87 has a personal question to you. She's curious as to your personal interest in Syria. You're a trusted political analyst, but she's never heard you talk about how you openly became curious about Syria and your personal investment in the country. And we can finish on that.
Yeah, on a personal note. Yeah, I never really talk about my personal stuff, but I mean, life springs at you lots of surprises. I can't say when I was at university that I was planning to dedicate my life to being a Syria analyst, but my first job straight out of university started in April 2011 in London. I was working at a company called Jane's, a long time kind of private analysis company, and I was on their terrorism and insurgency desk, so basically their conflict desk. And Syria was just developing, and I was the new guy. And they basically said, "Look, Syria seems to be becoming something. This is going to be your day job going forward." And I never really looked back. So that life springs on you these surprises. And then I have to say, in all of the time since, and having spent nearly 4 years in like track 1.5 negotiations with Syrians of all stripes. My responsibility was working with the armed groups, but as a result of being part of this big, massive process supported by 7 European governments, I was, speaking with folks from the regime, from tribes, from the opposition, from the business community, from religious communities, everyone, civil society. And that experience plus just studying it and working on it, I've got the sort of Syria fever, and I spent 13 years desperately pessimistic amidst the war, and so many people I know were killed on a number of different sides, and it was a really dark 13 years, but I felt like I couldn't stop, and over the last 7 months, change gives you a potential source of optimism despite all the challenges we've talked about today, and they are really, really big challenges, but it doesn't mean that there isn't now a potential cause for being hopeful for the future. We've got to get past all those challenges, but there's much more of a prospect for that now than there was while Assad was still in Damascus, and so I have a feeling I've got another 14 years ahead of me at least, of this. So thanks for your question.
Thank you so much, Charles. Thanks so much for joining us on the show. If you're watching on Twitch, thanks along for following along for the whole thing. And if you're watching on YouTube, please do like and subscribe. It really helps us out. And Charles, a big thank you from everyone here at the Katerji Show. Thank you for joining us. And we hope to have you back on, not only to tell us about what's hopefully good news on the horizon, but also a bit more about that negotiating work that you did. It really sounds fascinating. I think there's so much that you can really teach us about things that we don't know that happened over the course of that 14 years. So thanks so much for joining us, Charles. Have a great evening. And thanks again for coming on the show.
Sure, absolutely. Thanks for having me, and thanks everyone for your questions and hanging around for so long to hear me chime on.
It was brilliant. Thanks so much. All the best.
Okay, take care. Bye, everyone.
So that was Charles Lister. I will put a link to his Substack in the show notes. Again, a lot happening in Ukraine at the moment. I know we're recording to you live from Kyiv, so we're going to try and bring you some Ukraine information as the story continues to unfold here. More breaking news tonight as the Russians and the Ukrainians are apparently trying to head to some meeting between the two leaders. That came from Rustem Umarov's press conference tonight while we were on air. So, I mean, look, that we'll see where it goes. I have very little hope that there is anything to be negotiated between Moscow and Kyiv at the moment. And Kyiv has this whole situation brewing with this protest movement now against this anti-corruption legislation. So we'll see how things move forward with that. And we promise we'll try and bring you some Ukraine news next week. Our final guest of the week will be James Ball. He'll be on tomorrow. He's going to be talking about the whole Epstein files situation, how it's tearing Trump's base apart. That's going to be a fascinating conversation. And I personally, I haven't read much about the Epstein stuff, so I'm going to be learning a lot for the first time with you guys. So if you've got an interest in how this story unfolded, James is a real expert on these kinds of issues. He's been following along with the American right for quite some time, particularly on conspiracies and how that movement has metastasized around Trump, and why in particular Epstein is such a hot button topic for MAGA, the MAGA movement, shall we call them. So yeah, look, really good. That's going to be a fascinating discussion tomorrow night. So please do come and join us. Again, if you've been watching along and you're not following yet, please do follow. It really helps us out. As I said, growing 100% in such a short space of time has been really encouraging. But as you can see, it's still a small number, and we really want to grow and reach new audiences. I've had some questions from my audience on Twitter and places. They're asking, can I put this out as a podcast, or why don't I stream simultaneously on Twitter? The issue is I'm trying to grow my audience into new places, and if I was to bump all my numbers up immediately by using my Twitter audience, those people wouldn't migrate necessarily to Twitch and to YouTube. And still, I'm trying to reach new audiences here. So for the time being, I'm not going to put this out as a podcast. You can only watch it on YouTube or Twitch. And I'm not planning on cross-streaming on other platforms yet. The plan will be, as the show grows, we might take it onto some other platforms too. But for now, it's really important that we reach new audiences and grow. Because again, I've been locked in a kind of Twitter bubble for the majority of my career. And while that's been incredible for the opportunities that it's given me, it's also sort of meant that I haven't really invested much time in other platforms, and therefore I'm kind of, if you haven't got Twitter, you probably don't know who I am, and even if you have Twitter, you probably don't know who I am. But the hope will be that we can try and grow this a bit more with your support. So thanks, guys. It really means a lot. Again, lots of people liked and followed and subscribed today, and really appreciate that. It's just me doing this, so earning that little bit of money along the side really helps give me the time to kind of do things like guest booking and put these shows out. So really appreciate all of that support, guys. Tomorrow night we'll be bringing you James Ball. We'll be talking about the Epstein stuff. Thank you to everyone in the chat tonight. Random Algerian, Liquid Amber, Random Shot in the Dark, Spazalot, again my favorite name, Noor Ghazal, thank you for your first time chat. There's probably people that I'm missing out there. RGB, RVB. Sorry if I've missed your name, but thanks again so much for joining us in the chat again. Hope to see you all tomorrow night for the Epstein episode, and do keep paying attention to the channels that I've got, because we'll try and, I don't know how we're going to do it yet, but we will try and bring you some kind of live coverage of breaking events if we can. The interview format doesn't really give us the opportunity to do that as much. So if you're comfortable with just me talking at periods, I might bring some other shows that aren't on the set interview days. But for now, we're just going to keep moving forward with these interview formats, see how they go. We're 14 episodes in so far, so we're really just still at the start of all of this. I hope you can see that the technical side is starting to get smoother as things progress. You know, I'm learning on the job, as it were. Sometimes I forget to put the lights on because I've been out the protest, had to rush in. But yeah, we will keep growing. You will notice, you know, things around me improve and the studio gets, you know, more interesting to look at. So thanks everyone for joining us. Really, really appreciate it. Have a wonderful evening, and I will see you in the next show. Thank you and good night.